There was an old farmer in Arizona who owned the best farm in the area. Everybody said his crops were the best, and people came from all over to buy their goods from him. Whenever people asked him how he was able to grow such good quality crops, the old farmer would say it was all down to his scarecrow. "That old scarecrow is the one I have to thank," said the farmer. "He makes sure no crows or critters or pests come near my crops." The old farmer had built the scarecrow himself, and it was a fearsome sight. He spent months working on it to make it as scary as possible. He knew how important it was to keep pests away from his crops. So he gave it enormous straw arms that stretched out about 6 feet, and big long legs that made it as tall as a tree. But the scariest thing about the scarecrow was its head. The farmer carved it himself out of a huge pumpkin. He spent countless days and nights perfecting his design until it was perfect. The scarecrow's face and head was so grotesque and ugly that even he was sometimes scared to look at it. But it was very effective, scaring away every rodent and bird that ventured near. The neighboring farm was owned by 2 young men who were brothers named Josh and Harold. They were lazy and never did much work around the farm, which resulted in their crops being bad. They were jealous of the old farmer's success and were plotting against him. If they could drive him out of business, they could take over his farm and make more money. So one night, the brothers decided to sneak onto the old farmer's land. They stole his prize scarecrow and brought it back to their own house, where they stuffed it into an old closet so nobody would ever find it. The next day, the farmer woke up to find his hideous scarecrow missing and all his crops being eaten by rats and crows. He fell to his knees and cried, knowing that his farm would soon be out of business. Meanwhile, the brothers Josh and Harold were watching from their own property and couldn't help laughing out loud when they saw the old man's tears of grief. Hearing their laughter, the old farmer came over and asked them if they knew what happened to his scarecrow. The brothers looked him right in the eye and said they had no idea where his precious scarecrow might be. "But you know I'll go out of business and have to sell my farm if I can't find my scarecrow," said the farmer. Josh just laughed in his face, saying, "That's just your tough luck, isn't it?" "Sucks to be you," giggled Harold. The old farmer walked slowly back to his house, his head hanging down in defeat and desperation. That night, Josh and Harold had trouble sleeping. Not because they felt any remorse, but because they couldn't get the image of the scarecrow's horrible, twisted face out of their minds. They decided they would never be able to sleep as long as that ugly pumpkin head was in their house. So they got up and dragged the scarecrow out of the closet. Harold took a baseball bat and smashed the scarecrow's head to pieces until all that was left was little bits of pumpkin strewn about the floor. The brothers swept up the pumpkin head pieces and threw them in the trash. Then they went back to bed and were soon fast asleep, having put all thoughts of the disgusting scarecrow face out of their heads. Sometime after midnight, Josh and Harold were awoken by the sounds of scratching and clawing at their bedroom door. "Did you forget to put the dog out?" asked Harold sleepily. "We don't have a dog," stammered Josh. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open and a solitary long straw arm snaked in through the opening. Then a second arm thrashed around, followed by 2 long, stick legs. The 2 brothers were frozen in fear and could only look with horror as the headless scarecrow's body rose up on its long stick legs, and its long arms reached out for them in the darkness. Harold felt a cold, sinewy straw claw close around his ankle and screamed as loud as he could. He begged his brother Josh to help him, but Josh was already running out of the bedroom. Fleeing in terror, he ran down the hallway, crashed through the front door and out onto the moonlit road. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, puffing and panting and screaming at the top of his voice. As he passed his neighbor's house, he saw the old farmer standing at his gate. In the moonlight, he could see the farmer just staring at him, with a strange smile on his face. Josh kept running, his bare feet slapping against the rough gravel road. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw something that scared him to his very soul. He saw the scarecrow, running along the road close behind him. It was gaining on him, coming closer and closer. And that wasn't all he saw. He noticed that the scarecrow had a brand new head, and it looked a lot like Harold. On Thursday nights, a boy named Jim had to work late at the local supermarket. He worked as a stock boy in one of the malls outside of town and was often the last one to leave. By 8:30, his work was finished. He locked up the store and made his way home. By the time he got out to the huge parking lot, it was almost empty. The only sound he could hear was the echo of his own footsteps on the pavement. As Jim walked down a deserted alleyway, he heard a strange rustling sound. Suddenly, a man stepped out of the shadows. His face was misshapen and deformed.
"Hey kid, over here,"
he called in a low voice. The man held out his right hand. He was holding a long, thin knife. The razor-sharp blade glinted in the dim light. Jim stopped in his tracks.
"Nice, sharp knife,"
the man said softly. "Don't panic," Jim told himself. He was shaking in his boots. The man took a few steps toward him and smiled, revealing a row of rotten teeth. "Don't run," Jim told himself. "Just stay calm."
"Nice, sharp knife,"
the man repeated. "Just give him what he wants," Jim thought. "Then he'll let you go." The man came closer. He held the knife up.
"Cuts nice and easy,"
he said slowly. Jim tried to stop himself from screaming out loud. The man peered into his face.
"Hey kid, you want to buy a knife? Only $3. 2 for $5. It'll make a nice present for your mother."
"No thanks," Jim said. "She's already got one." And he ran away as fast as his legs would carry him. There was a small village in Ireland that lay on the edge of a large bog. The marshy land stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with small bushy weeds and the skeletons of tall, ragged trees. with branches that reached out like long, twisted arms. The soggy ground could be dangerous, because it was riddled with many deep bog holes that were filled with black, murky water. The bog holes were often hidden behind clumps of foliage, and it was important to watch your step. If a man accidentally fell down a bog hole, he would never come up again. It was a fearsome place, if all the tales told about it are true. It was before my time, but I've heard many a strange story about the bog, and it would make your skin creep just to listen to them. Every day the men in the village went out onto the bog and toiled for hours, cutting the turf. They loaded it up into wheelbarrows and hauled it home to dry in the sun. They used the turf for fuel, burning it in the fireplace to heat their homes. They were also able to sell it to make money. But after the sun had set, nobody would dare venture out into the darkness, into that desolate bog. In the moonlight, the wind would whistle through the dead branches of the twisted trees. Those who lived nearby would often glimpse those strange shapes creeping across the deserted stretch of swamp. There were rumors throughout the village that strange creatures emerged from the bog holes at night. People were so afraid that they refused to leave their homes after dark. There was only one person in the village who did not believe in those creatures. A tall young man by the name of Tom McManus. Everybody knew him as Long Tom. On his way home from work, as the light began to fade, he'd often whisper to his friends, "There's one." And they would jump and run. And Tom would laugh and laugh. Finally, some of his friends turned on him. "If you know so much," they said, "why don't you go out onto the bog some night and see what happens to you?" "I'll do it," said Long Tom. "Sure, don't I work out there every day? Not once have I ever seen anything to frighten me. Why would it be different at night? Tomorrow night I'll take my lantern and walk out to the hanging willow tree in the middle of the bog. If I get scared and run, I'll never make fun of you again." The next night, the men went to Long Tom McManus's house to see him on his way. It was the blackest of nights, and thick clouds obscured the moon, blocking out the light. When they arrived, Tom's mother was pleading with him to not go. "It'll be all right," he said. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Don't be foolish like the rest." He took his lantern, and singing to himself, headed down the path that led to the bog. Some of the young men wondered if Tom wasn't right. Maybe they were afraid of things that did not exist. A few decided to follow him and see for themselves, but they stayed far behind in case he ran into trouble. They were sure they saw dark shapes moving about, but Tom's lantern kept bobbing up and down, and Tom's voice kept floating back to them, and nothing happened. Finally, they caught sight of the willow tree. There was Tom standing in a circle of light, looking this way and that, whistling a happy tune. All of a sudden, the wind blew out his lantern, and Tom suddenly stopped whistling. The men stood silent and still in the blackness, straining their eyes to see, and waiting for something awful to happen. When the clouds shifted and the moon peeked out again, they caught a glimpse of Long Tom. His back was up against the willow tree, and his arms were out in front of him as if he was fighting something off. It seemed like the very darkness was alive with slimy, creeping things. Strange shapes were swirling about him. They could hear loud wails and awful moaning sounds. Then, the clouds covered the moon again, and once more it was as black as pitch. By now, the men were on their knees, praying for dear life and calling upon the Virgin Mary and all the saints to protect them. When the moon came out again, Tom's face was as pale as death. He was desperately hanging onto the willow tree with one arm. His other arm was stretched out in front of him and something was pulling on it. It looked like a disembodied hand with rotting flesh dripping off the moldy bones, and it had a tight grasp on poor Tom's arm. Stronger and stronger it pulled, until at last, Tom lost his grip on the tree and was dragged off into the night, shrieking like a soul in hell. That's what the men said they witnessed before Tom was swallowed up by the darkness. When the clouds blotted out the moon once more, the men turned and ran through the blackness toward the village. Again and again they lost the path and fell into the muck, struggling to avoid the deadly bog holes. In the end, they crawled back on their hands and knees, but Tom McManus was not with them. In the morning, the people searched everywhere for Tom. Finally, they gave him up for lost. That evening, the villagers heard a cry. It was Tom's mother. She was rushing down the path from the bog, shouting and waving. When the villagers spotted her, she frantically gestured to them to follow her. Struggling to overcome their fears, the villagers ran after her. And when she came to a stop, they found young Tom McManus slumped against a willow tree, shaking and gibbering as if he had lost his mind. His left hand was raised in the air, pointing, and his wild eyes were staring at something only he could see. Where his right hand should have been, there was nothing more than a bloody stump. It had been ripped clean off. Nobody ever knew for sure what it was that he had seen. Some people claimed that he had been attacked by the dead hand, and others said that it was just the talk of drunken, superstitious fools. The only person who really knew what happened that night was young Tom McManus, but he never spoke another word again. He spent the rest of his short life barricaded in his bedroom, shaking and trembling through the long nights. He didn't make it to the end of the year, and when they lowered him into his grave, his grieving mother cried out to the people gathered in the churchyard and begged them to never be so foolhardy as to venture out onto the cursed bog in the middle of the night. There was a lonely old woman who got sick and eventually died. She had no family and no close friends, so her neighbors got together and dug a grave for her. They asked the undertaker to make a coffin for her, and they dressed her up in her best clothes and laid her body out in her living room. When the woman died, her eyes were wide open, staring at everything and seeing nothing. This disturbed the neighbors so much that they found 2 shiny silver coins on her dresser and put them on her eyelids to keep them closed. As was the tradition at the time, they held a wake so that people could come by and pay their respects. The neighbors lit some candles and sat up with her corpse so that she would not be alone. The next morning, the gravedigger arrived to collect her body and take it to the cemetery. When he was about to start digging the grave, he opened the coffin and peered inside. When he saw the silver coins covering her eyes, he immediately snatched them and stuffed them in his pocket. Looking down at the dead woman, a chill ran down his spine. Her wide open eyes seemed to be staring at him, watching him as he stole her silver coins. It gave him a creepy feeling, so he grabbed a hammer and quickly nailed the lid on the coffin shut. Then he buried her as fast as he could. When the gravedigger got home, he put the 2 silver coins in a tin box and shook it, listening to the rattling sound. try as he might, he couldn't forget those eyes staring at him. He placed the tin box on his mantelpiece. That night it grew dark, and the wind started blowing. The storm shook the house and rattled the windows. A cold wind whistled through the cracks in the walls and down the chimney. The gravedigger threw some more wood on the fire and jumped into bed, pulling the covers up over his head. The wind kept blowing through the cracks. The fire flared and flickered and cast evil-looking shadows on the walls. Lying in bed, the gravedigger couldn't stop thinking about the dead woman's eyes staring at him. And as the wind blew stronger and stronger, and louder, and the fire popped and snapped, he began to get scared. Suddenly, he heard another sound. It was the silver dollars rattling in the tin box. "Hey!" shouted the gravedigger. "Who's there? Who's stealing my money?" But all he heard was the wind blowing, and the flames flaring and flickering, and snapping and popping, and the coins rattling. Shaking with fear, he flung off the covers and sat up in bed. Looking around, he couldn't see anything. He leaped out of bed and barred and chained the door. Then he went back to bed, but his head had barely touched the pillow when he heard. Then he heard something way off in the distance. It was a voice crying,
"Where is my money? Give me my money."
And the wind blew, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the coins in the tin box rattled. The gravedigger was really scared. He got out of bed again and piled all the furniture against the door, and he put out a heavy iron skillet over the tin box. Then he jumped back into bed and covered his head with the blankets. But the money rattled louder than ever, and the way-off voice cried,
"Give me my money. I want my money."
And the wind blew, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the gravedigger shivered and shook and hollered out loud. Suddenly the front door flew open, and in walked the dead woman he had buried. Her eyes were wide open, staring at everything and seeing nothing, and the wind blew, and the money rattled, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the ghost of the dead woman cried,
"Oh, where is my money? Who took my money?"
And the gravedigger watched in horror as the woman came closer and closer, her hands groping in the air, as if she could hear her silver coins in the tin box going clinkety clink. Her cold, dead hands groped around trying to find it. And the wind blew, and the money rattled clinkety clink, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the gravedigger shivered and shook and moaned. And the woman cried,
"Give me my money. Who's got my money?"
And suddenly she jumped on the man and screamed,
"You've got my money."
There was a young woman who married a man from the south. They lived together in a small cabin by the river. The pair got along pretty well, and they had 2 little boys. The woman only had one problem. Her husband was always going out at night. Sometimes he would be gone for hours, and sometimes he would stay out all night. He would always go swimming in the river, and the darker it was, the better he liked it, because he could see at night just like an owl. As soon as the boys were big enough to walk, he took them swimming with him. They would stay in the river all night long, and the woman had to sleep at home by herself. After a while, the woman started acting very strange. She told the neighbors that her husband was turning into an alligator, and he was trying to turn their little boys into alligators too. "Something has to be done about it," she said. The neighbors thought the woman was losing her mind. They told her it was normal for boys to go swimming with their father, and everybody knew there weren't any alligators in that part of the country. Finally, one Sunday morning, the woman came running into town. Her clothes were soaking wet, and she told the preacher that a big alligator and 2 little alligators had pulled her into the river. She said they were trying to make her live in the river and forcing her to eat raw fish. She claimed it was her husband and her 2 little boys, and they were trying to turn her into an alligator too. But she broke loose and managed to crawl out onto the bank. It all sounded so crazy that the townspeople took the woman to the doctor. They were afraid she might hurt herself in some way. They could hear her hollering all over town until the doctor gave her an injection to knock her out. The sheriff went out to the cabin by the river, but there was nobody there. About a week after that, the doctor sent the woman to a mental institution, and she never came back. Her husband and the 2 little boys never showed up again either, and to this day, nobody knows what became of them. For years after that, hunters and fishermen would see alligators in the river on moonlit nights. They said there was always one big alligator and 2 little ones, but nobody believed them. Everybody knows there aren't any alligators in this part of the country. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper. They had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. They decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. "Maybe they rent rooms," the wife said. So they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee, brought out some cake, and the 4 of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped at a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground 10 years ago. The old man and woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only now there was no house. All they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman started screaming. In the rubble, there was a badly burned table, and on that table was the envelope they had left there that morning. A long time ago, there was a house that stood on the bay near Mobile, Alabama. It was known as the Madison Mansion, and it had been vacant and boarded up for years. Most people in the area kept well away from it, frightened by its uncanny reputation. Anyone who passed by couldn't help wondering what evil had transpired in the old place. Trespassers who dared to enter the old house usually fled during the night, telling tales so grisly that they were almost beyond belief. One night, 3 fishermen were caught in a quick-moving storm and managed to make their way back to shore. Drenched by the rain, they spotted the mansion and decided to take shelter in the rickety old place. Once inside, they made a fire in the fireplace to keep themselves warm and ate a cold supper. Then the 3 men pulled their oilskin coats tightly around them and lay on the floor to try to get some sleep. However, as soon as they dozed off, they were plagued by terrible nightmares of treachery and murder. Lying awake, the men heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. It sounded like more than one person, marching back and forth. "Who's there?" called one of the fishermen. The footsteps suddenly stopped. They heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. The house was quiet again. Just then, the man who had called out felt something splash against his forehead. Something was dripping from the ceiling and forming a small, red puddle on the floor. To their horror, the fishermen realized it was blood. All of a sudden, a door upstairs crashed open and the floor shook with the sound of heavy footsteps. It sounded like a woman was being chased by a man. The frightened fishermen heard disembodied voices in the darkness. A man shouted in anger. A woman cried out in pain. They heard objects being flung here and there with a crash. Long howls of horrible laughter rose and filled the house. It went on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. Then, there was silence. The fishermen huddled together and listened. After a few minutes, they heard something coming down the stairs. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy that bumped on each rotten step. The scraping and thumping noises came through the front hall and the front door opened. It sounded like something was flung outside, landing with a thump among the weeds. Then the door slammed shut again. And then silence. There was a thunderstorm outside, and the house trembled as if it was about to collapse. Rain was pouring against the sagging walls. The terrified fishermen couldn't bear to stay in this place a moment longer, and decided to flee. Just as they reached the door, a flash of lightning filled every room in the house with a green blaze, and one of the men saw a ghastly face staring at them from the stairs. It was so horrible that it looked as if it came from hell itself. A crash of thunder deafened the terrified men, and they ran out into the storm, never to return. Nobody ever knew for sure what terrible deeds had been done in that house. The mansion was built shortly after the American Revolution by an Englishman named Madison, who was a rich recluse. He lived there with his daughter, who was said to be mentally ill. Nobody ever saw her, and the servants were kept well away from her. They never had any visitors and never went out. One day, without a word of warning, Madison suddenly left for England and wrote to his servants, instructing them to sell the house. The daughter was never found. She just disappeared. After that, the house changed hands many times, but nobody could ever stay there for long. in the mountains of West Virginia, there's a little place called French Creek. Many years ago, a man by the name of Bill Williams lived there. He was tall and slim and worked as a butcher. At the time, West Virginia had a problem. The timber wolves in the area had gotten out of hand. They were killing cattle and sheep, and the farmers couldn't stop them. The state of West Virginia put a bounty on wolves. They said they would pay hunters $10 for every wolf pelt they turned in. Bill Williams thought that was pretty good money, so he gave up his job as a butcher and turned his attention to hunting wolves. As it turned out, he was very good at it. Every year he managed to kill over 500 wolves. At a bounty of $10 per pelt, that came to over $5,000, which was a huge amount of money in those days. After 5 years of this, Bill had killed so many wolves that there were barely any left in the area. They were almost becoming extinct, and the few that were left were smart enough to stay hidden. So Bill decided to retire. He said the wolves had made him rich, so he swore that he would never harm a wolf again. Every day he just sat in the local store, chewing tobacco, whittling on a piece of wood, and telling tall tales about his hunting expeditions to anyone who would listen. Everything went well for a few years. Then one day a farmer burst into the store. He said that a white wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He claimed he managed to get a shot and had hit it 3 times. The bullets didn't have any effect on it, the farmer said. Soon, other farmers began spotting the white wolf all over the countryside, killing their livestock. They shot at it, but no matter how many times they hit the wolf, nothing seemed to stop it. The people begged Bill to do something about it, but he refused. The white wolf went on killing, and it seemed that nothing was safe. The bloody, half-eaten corpses of cows and sheep littered the countryside. Then, one night, the wolf came into Bill's yard and killed his pet cow. Bill was so angry that he forgot about his promise to never harm another wolf. He swore he would get revenge, and the next morning he went out and bought a young lamb to use as bait. He took it out into the hills and tied it to a tree. Then he backed off about 50 yards and hid behind another tree. With his shotgun in his lap, he sat there and lay in wait. After a few days, when Bill didn't return, the people in town went looking for him. Finally, they came across the young lamb. It was still tied to the tree and seemed to be unharmed. Then they spotted Bill. He was slumped against the other tree, but he was dead. His throat had been torn open. There were no signs of a struggle. His gun hadn't been fired, and there were no tracks in the soil around him. As for the white wolf, it was never seen again. But some people say that when the moon is full, you can still hear it howling. An old man was out for a walk. When a storm came up, he looked for a place to take shelter. Soon he came to an old house. He ran up on the porch and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. By now, rain was pouring down, thunder was booming, and lightning was flashing. So he tried the door. When he found it was unlocked, he went inside. Except for a pile of wooden boxes, the house was empty. He broke up some of the boxes and made fire with them. Then he sat down in front of the fire and dried himself. It was warm and cozy, and he fell asleep. When he woke up, a black cat was sitting near the fire. It stared at him for a while, and then it purred. "That's a nice cat," he thought, and he dozed off again. When he opened his eyes, there was a second cat in the room. But this one was as big as a wolf. It looked at him very closely, and it asked,
"Shall we do it now?" "No,"
said the other cat.
"Let's wait till Martin comes."
"I must be dreaming," thought the old man. He closed his eyes again. Then he took another look. But now there was a third cat in the room, and this one was as big as a tiger. It looked the old man over, and it asked,
"Shall we do it now?" "No,"
said the others.
"Let's wait till Martin comes."
The old man jumped up, jumped out the window and started running. "When Martin comes, tell him I couldn't wait," he called. There were two young boys named Trevor and Will. They spent most of their summer vacation hanging around town looking for things to do. One hot August night, the boys were sitting on a fence by the main road. There was a cornfield just across the road. Suddenly, Trevor spotted something in the field. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out, but he thought it looked like some kind of weird animal. He nudged his friend and pointed in the direction of the strange-looking figure. Will said he could see it too. He wasn't sure, but the mysterious thing seemed vaguely human. The next thing they knew, the thing was gone. The boys craned their necks and scanned the field with their eyes. Out of the blackness came the thing. It slowly walked over to the edge of the field before disappearing again. Trevor and Will looked at each other, puzzled. "What was that?" asked Will. "I have no idea," replied Trevor. No sooner had he said that than Trevor felt a clammy hand on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into the hideous face of the thing. He let out a yell of terror and surprise. The rotting skin on the thing's face was coming off in places, revealing the bone underneath. For a moment, it stared silently at Trevor with its dark, sunken eyes. Then, it suddenly grabbed hold of his arm. Trevor felt its fingernails dig into his flesh as he wriggled out of its grasp. The two boys leaped off the fence and ran down the road, screaming in horror. They didn't stop running until they reached their homes. They tried to tell their parents and friends about the thing they had seen, but nobody believed them. When Trevor woke up the next morning, the scratches on his arm were still there. After a few days, they got worse and worse. Trevor got sick, and his parents took him to see a doctor. After examining his arm, the doctor told the boy it was infected and gave him some pills to take. Unfortunately, Trevor's condition got worse and worse. The infection spread to his entire arm, and it wasn't long before his flesh was rotting and falling off. He was taken to a hospital, but no matter what the doctors did, no treatment seemed to work. The infection spread throughout his whole body. Trevor was confined to bed and started to waste away. It seemed like he was beyond help, and as the days went by, he steadily grew worse and worse. His anguished parents could only sit at his bedside and cry. as they watched their beloved son slowly rotting away before their eyes. On the day that Trevor finally passed away, Will came to the hospital to visit him. When the boy walked into the hospital room and saw Trevor lying in bed, he was horrified. His friend looked exactly like the Thing. One summer night, a teenage boy was going out on a date with his new girlfriend. He picked her up at her house and they drove out to the edge of town. They parked the car in a secluded spot that was a well-known lover's lane. As they gazed out at the lights of the town, the boy put his arm around the girl and switched on the car radio so they could listen to some romantic music. He leaned over and the young couple began kissing and cuddling. Just as they were getting into the mood, the music suddenly stopped, and a newsreader's voice came on the radio. This is an emergency announcement. Earlier tonight, a crazed murderer escaped from the state mental asylum. Police are warning citizens to be on their guard, since the patient is considered armed and dangerous. The insane killer is nicknamed the Hook Man, because after he lost his right hand in an accident, it was replaced with a steel hook. Everyone in the area should be on the lookout for a man fitting this description. If you see anything suspicious, you should report it to the police immediately. The girl became frightened and asked to be taken home. She knew that the state insane asylum was not far from Lover's Lane. She was also worried that the remote area where they were parked was the perfect spot for a deranged madman to lurk. The boy was feeling brave and assured his girlfriend that they were perfectly safe. He locked all the car doors and then tried to kiss her again. The girl became frantic and pushed away, insisting that they leave immediately. In a huff, the boy slammed the car into gear and spun its wheels as he pulled out of the parking space. On the way back to the town, they both calmed down, but the girl still held on tightly to her boyfriend. When they pulled up outside the girl's house, the boy got out of the car and walked around to open the door for his girlfriend. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the door. At first, the girl couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then she realized that her door was still locked. She smiled and unlocked it. Still, the boy just stood there. The girl was puzzled and rolled down her window. She saw that the boy was staring down at the door handle. Slowly, she looked down herself and began to scream uncontrollably. There, hanging from the door handle, was a bloody stainless steel hook. Once upon a time, there were two little girls. Their names were Blue Eyes and Turkey. Blue Eyes was named after the color of her eyes, and Turkey after the red dress she wore. They lived in a little house on the moor with their mother and their baby brother Arthur. Their father was a sailor, and he was always at sea, traveling to faraway lands. One day, Blue Eyes and Turkey went for a walk upon the moor when they met a gypsy girl playing on a little drum. As she played, a little mechanical man and woman came out of the drum and danced. Blue Eyes and Turkey were enchanted. They had never seen such an amazing toy, and they begged the gypsy girl to give them the drum. The girl just laughed. "I will give it to you," she said, "but only if you are very naughty. Come back tomorrow and tell me how naughty you were. Then we shall see." As soon as Blue Eyes and Turkey got home, they began to behave as badly as they could. They started shouting. They spilled their food on the floor. They drew all over the walls with their crayons and refused to go to bed. The two sisters did everything they could to upset their mother. The next day, they got up very early and hurried out onto the moor. There, they found the gypsy girl, playing on her drum. "We were very naughty yesterday," they cried. "Can we please have the drum now?" "Tell me what you did," the gypsy girl replied. So they told her. The gypsy girl just laughed. "Oh no," she said. "You were only a little bit naughty. You're going to have to be far worse than that if you want this drum." As soon as the sisters got home that day, they were as naughty as they could be. They threw their cups on the floor. They tore their clothes. They walked in the mud up to their knees and pulled up all the flowers in the garden. They also let the pig out of the pen and let it run away. Their mother was even more horrified than before by their behavior. "If you don't stop this," said the mother, "I will go away and take Arthur with me, and you will get a new mother, one with glass eyes and a wooden tail." That scared Blue Eyes and Turkey. They loved their mother, and they loved their baby brother Arthur. They could not imagine being without them, and the thought of it made them cry. "I don't want to leave you," their mother said. "But unless you change your behavior, I will have to go away." "We'll be good," the girls promised. Yet, they did not believe that their mother would really go away. "She's just trying to scare us," Blue Eyes said later. "We'll get the drum tomorrow," said Turkey. "Then we can go back to being good again." The next day, the sisters got up very early and rushed off to meet the gypsy girl. When they found her, she was playing with the drum again, and the little mechanical man and woman were dancing back and forth. They told the gypsy girl how naughty they had been the day before. "That must be bad enough to get the drum," they said. "Oh no," replied the gypsy girl with a smile. "You will have to be much worse than that." "But we promised our mother we'd be on our best behavior from now on," said the sisters. "If you really want the drum," said the gypsy girl, "you must be much naughtier." "It's only for one more day," Blue Eyes told Turkey. "Then we will have the drum." "I hope you're right," Turkey said nervously. Again, she told them that they had not been naughty enough. "You must be really bad," she said. As soon as they got home that evening, the young girl set about being as naughty as possible. This time, they broke the kitchen table and the chairs. They smashed all the fine china and ripped their clothes to shreds. And if that wasn't enough, the girls whipped the dog unmercifully, and they beat their baby brother with a stick, and they punched their mother in the face. Their mother began to cry. "Blue Eyes and Turkey," she sobbed, "you're not keeping your promise. If you don't stop being so naughty, I will have to go away, and instead you will have a new mother, with glass eyes and a wooden tail to live with you." "We will be good," said Blue Eyes. "We promise," said Turkey. "I hope so," said their mother. "I can't wait much longer. Please try to behave yourselves." However, the two girls still had their hearts set on the amazing drum, and when they were alone, they said to each other, "Tomorrow we will be good. Once we have got that drum, we will be good again." Early the next morning, before their mother was awake, Blue Eyes and Turkey ran out to the moor. There they found the gypsy girl. They told her all about the bad things they had done the day before. "We were horrid," said Turkey. "We were worse than we've ever been," said Blue Eyes. "You have to give us the drum now." That was when they noticed that the gypsy girl wasn't playing with the drum. In fact, it was nowhere to be seen. "Where is the drum?" the sisters cried. The gypsy girl just laughed. "It is gone. We gypsies are all going away today. I'm the last to leave." "But we did as you told us," cried Blue Eyes and Turkey. The gypsy girl laughed again. "Yes, I know," she said. "You have been really naughty. And now your mother has gone away, far, far away. And instead you have a mother with glass eyes and a wooden tail." Blue Eyes and Turkey began to cry. They rushed home as quickly as they could. But their mother and Arthur were gone. "Maybe they're just out shopping," said Blue Eyes hopefully. "Yes, they'll be back soon, I'm sure of it," said Turkey, trying to reassure herself. But when lunchtime came and went, and they were still not back, Blue Eyes and Turkey began to feel lonely and scared. They wandered on the moor all day, but when evening came, they went back home. The lights in the house were off, but when they peered through the window, they could see their new mother's glass eyes glistening in the glow of the firelight, and they could hear her wooden tail thumping on the floor. Lexi Morgan had a dream. She was walking up a dark staircase, and when she got to the top, she walked into a bedroom. The bedroom carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lexi went to sleep in the bedroom, but during the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes, and long black hair slipped silently into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can." Then the black-haired woman grabbed her arm. Lexi Morgan woke up with a scream and laid awake the rest of the night, shivering and shaking with fear. In the morning, she told her landlady that she had decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady asked. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So, Lexi Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room and a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be. "Let's look at that room," she said. "I think you'll like it." They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lexi's dream. In these old houses, the staircases are all the same, Lexi thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors, and the windows fastened with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lexi told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady asked. "I'm not sure," Lexi said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring up some tea while you think about it." Lexi sat on the bed staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon, there was a knock at the door. "It's the landlady with the tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman, with the pale face, and the black eyes, and the long black hair. Lexi Morgan grabbed her things and fled. There was a 16-year-old boy who got a summer job working on his grandfather's farm. One morning, his grandfather sent him into town on an errand to buy some provisions. The boy drove the pickup truck into town and parked outside the market. As he was walking along the street, he was jostled by someone in the crowd. When he turned around, he was shocked to see that it was the Grim Reaper. Death. As he stood there in the marketplace, Death beckoned to him. The terrified boy jumped back and ran to the pickup truck and drove back to the farm as fast as he could. When he got there, white-faced and trembling, he told his grandfather what had happened. "Let me take the truck," he begged. "I'll go to the city and hide. Death will never be able to find me there. It's the only way to avoid my fate." His grandfather told him he could have the truck, and the boy floored the accelerator and tore off at high speed. After he left, the grandfather went into town looking for Death. Eventually, he found the Grim Reaper standing in the crowded marketplace. The grandfather walked right up to Death and asked, "Why did you frighten my grandson when you saw him this morning? He's just a boy, only 16 years of age. He's too young to die."
"I'm sorry about that,"
said Death.
"I did not mean to beckon him. I was just startled. You see, I was very surprised to see him here in the marketplace. I have an appointment with him this afternoon in the city."
There was an old woman, all skin and bone, who lived near the graveyard all alone. She thought she'd go to the church one day to hear the preacher sing and pray. And when she came to the graveyard stile, she thought she'd stop and rest a while. And when she came to the old church door, she stopped to rest a little more. But when she turned and looked around, she saw a corpse upon the ground. The worms crawled out, the worms crawled in, from up his nose down to his chin. The worms crawled in, the worms crawled out, across his eyes, his ears, and mouth. The woman to the preacher said, "Will I look like that when I am dead?" "You already do," the preacher said. "You're skin and bone because you're dead." The woman fainted with the shock and split her head on a sharp rock. They buried the woman, all skin and bone. But from the grave they heard her moan. "I'm not dead yet," the woman cried. "You will be soon," the priest replied. There was a young girl named Josephine who was habitually late for Sunday morning mass at her local church. She always forgot to set her alarm and wouldn't wake up in time. Finally, she got tired of her parents telling her off and decided she would never be late for mass again. One Sunday morning, Josephine woke up at midnight. Unaware of what time it was, she thought she had overslept again and jumped out of bed. She quickly got dressed and ran out the door without ever looking at the clock. It was still dark outside, but it usually was dark at that time of year. It was very quiet and there was nobody else on the street. The only sound she could hear was the noise of her own footsteps on the pavement as she hurried towards the church. When she heard the church bell ring, she quickened her pace and took a shortcut through the cemetery. She got to the church just as the service was about to begin. She found a seat and took a look around. Much to her surprise, she didn't recognize anyone. The church was filled with people she had never seen before. They were all staring straight ahead, and an eerie silence hung over the gathering. When the priest came out to celebrate Mass, Josephine realized that he was a stranger too. The priest told the congregation to pray for the soul of a young girl named Francois who had died the night before. Josephine was shocked. She knew Francois, and she had never even heard that the poor girl was ill. Something was radically wrong. She began to feel very uneasy. She looked around again. As her eyes began to adjust to the dim light, she saw someone she knew. There was an old woman sitting at the back of the church. Josephine's heart sank when she remembered the old woman had died the year before. Looking towards the front of the church, she saw that some of the people sitting there looked very strange. Their skin seemed to be pearly white. One of them turned his head, and Josephine discovered to her horror that he was nothing but a skeleton in a suit. Just a skull and some bones. This is a mass for the dead, thought Josephine. Everybody here is dead except me. It's a specter's mass. She noticed that some of them were staring at her. Their eyes were filled with anger. It was clear to her that she had no business being there. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Nervously, she turned around and found her grandfather standing in the row behind her. He had been dead for 3 years. There was a worried look on his face. He leaned towards her and whispered in her ear, "Leave right now, while you still can," he hissed. "You don't belong here." Josephine immediately grabbed her coat and walked towards the door. She heard hollow footsteps echoing behind her and glanced back. The dead were rising out of their seats and following her. Their faces were twisted in fury and hate. Josephine was terrified as she dashed to the door, a pack of shrieking ghosts snapping at her heels. She felt skeletal hands grabbing at her, trying to stop her from leaving. She twisted and turned, struggling to free herself from their grasp. Her coat was ripped off and her hat was snatched from her head, just as she managed to slip out the door. Screaming and crying and almost out of her mind with fear, Josephine ran all the way home and told her parents what had happened. Later that day, someone came to the house holding what was left of Josephine's coat and hat. They had been found in the cemetery, torn to shreds. From the time I was old enough to notice things, I didn't like that house. I was afraid of the upstairs. I never felt safe there. Mama always kept the light burning at bedtime because I was afraid of the dark. One evening when I was 9, my sister was downstairs and I was asleep in bed. She was expecting Mama to come home at any moment. When she heard the front door open, my sister called out, "Hello, Mama." But there was no answer. She heard footsteps, but they didn't sound like Mama. Her footsteps were light, but these were heavy, like a man. "Who's there?" my sister called, but there was no reply. The footsteps continued up the stairs and wandered into the bedrooms. But when my sister called out again, "Who's there?" the footsteps stopped. She was young and afraid, but she knew I was sleeping alone up there. So she took the lamp and searched all the rooms. She even went into the attic, but didn't find anyone. My sister went back down to the dining room, but as soon as she sat down, the footsteps started again. They came down the stairs, through the dark kitchen, and then the door of the dining room where my sister was sitting slowly began to open. She was scared out of her wits. "Get out!" she screamed. The door slowly closed and the footsteps moved out through the kitchen, towards the front door. She heard the door open and shut, so she ran to the window to see who it was. There was nobody in sight, and there were no footprints in the fresh snow. That was when she realized that whoever or whatever had walked in, it wasn't human. She huddled on the couch and waited for Mama to come home. Not long after that, we moved out. But something strange happened before we left. My sister and I were in the living room when all of a sudden we heard terrible groans. It sounded like someone was in agony. The groans seemed to be coming from the cellar. They were so loud that our dog started howling, and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. She would always go anywhere with me, but when I tried to coax her to come down into the cellar with me and investigate, she wouldn't go. The cellar was well lit, so my sister and I went down, following the groans until we came to a little alcove, and then the groans ceased. I wanted to dig right there on the spot, but there was no time. I've always felt that if we had, we would have found the cause of all our trouble. Perhaps someone's bones were buried there. We moved away soon after that, and Mama would never let me ask the people living there today if they had heard anything. We were all glad to get out of that house. A man walked into a hotel late one night and asked for a room. The hotel manager told him the hotel was all booked up. "We've only got one room left," he said. "It's on the 13th floor, but we don't rent that one because it's haunted." "I'll take it," said the businessman. "I don't believe in all that nonsense about ghosts." The man took the key and went up to the room to get some sleep. As soon as he turned off the lights and got into bed, he heard the closet door squeak open. A pale, ghostly figure emerged from the closet and staggered forth, its fingers dripping with blood.
"Bloody fingers,
It moaned. When the man laid eyes on this horrible sight, he grabbed his suitcase and ran out of the room, still wearing his pajamas. He left the hotel that very night. The next night, an old woman arrived at the hotel, very late. The manager told her the same thing. "We've only got one room left, but it's on the 13th floor and we don't rent it because the room is haunted." "Sonny, I've seen a lot in my day," she told him. "Trust me, nothing could possibly bother me." As soon as she switched off the lights and got into bed, the closet door creaked open, and a ghastly figure stepped out. Its fingers were still dripping with blood all over the floor.
"Bloody fingers,
it moaned. The old woman shrieked and ran as fast as her legs could carry her. A week later, a teenage boy arrived at the hotel very late. He also took the haunted room, despite the manager's warning. He paid for his room, got the key, and headed upstairs. After he had unpacked, he took out his guitar and began to strum some tunes. Soon, the closet door creaked open, and the ghost appeared. As before, its fingers were bleeding, soaking the carpet with blood, and it was moaning.
"Bloody fingers.
The boy didn't pay attention to the ghostly figure. He just kept strumming his guitar. The ghost kept moaning and its fingers kept bleeding.
"Bloody fingers,
it moaned. Finally, the boy stopped playing the guitar. He looked straight at the hideous apparition and said, "Shut up and get yourself a Band-Aid."